I'm Arthur. I just wrapped up my PhD at UChicago, where I studied and developed privacy and online transparency tools with a focus on consumers. Cool. All right, so today we're going to talk a little bit about barriers and kind of the pillars around personal data portability. So data portability is one of the key rights that pops up again and again in a bunch of privacy legislation that I'm sure you're aware of, like the GDPR. And it essentially grants the consumer the ability to move their data from one service, say Amazon Music, to Spotify, like in this example. Of course, this can be applied to much more than just transferring music. You can think of this for things like photos, private messages, like emails, and so on and so forth, and AI agents today and so on. While the EU, of course, continues to lead the charge in this, even more recently with like the DMA and the AI Act, the US and Canada and dozens of countries around the world are catching up pretty quickly. So just to give you a sense, and I'm sure many of you know this, in the past year or so, 5 US states have granted portability rights to their residents. So portability and the other privacy rights that usually come attached to portability, namely access, deletion, and modification, are much more than just ways for consumers to express their privacy rights or their agency over their data. We kind of think that they also promote competition and innovation amongst different platforms and companies, and attracts really users and helps them acclimate to the new product as well by making the transition into that new product much easier. So yeah, the promise of portability goes way beyond just compliance and meeting the requirements that these laws set out. Despite its importance and how often it shows up in privacy legislation, though, portability is not nearly as widely discussed or really used by consumers as the other laws I mentioned, like access and deletion, for example. In fact, you might even see this when you look up the CCPA reports from different platforms. Portability is rarely mentioned as like a request that gets tracked on its own, separate from access. And there's a reason for this, which I'll go into later, or one of the reasons. So what makes portability so tricky then? We kind of spent a lot of time investigating this, and in our mental model of portability, there are kind of 3 hurdles that we need to overcome in order to kind of build a true portability system. And these 3 are usability for consumers, interoperability between platforms, and establishing trust between these 3 agents that are involved in the data portability scenario. And while the usability challenges are universal for kind of all the data subject rights, like the ones I've mentioned before, interoperability and trust are kind of unique to this use case of portability that we're talking about. And while we've made a lot of progress in these 3 areas, specifically as it relates to portability, as we'll kind of show in the rest of this talk, there's still quite a way to go in order to make it usable and useful for consumers. So, from the consumer usability perspective, most data transfers follow the import-export model that's actually shared a lot of the time with data access request mechanisms. In this mechanism, the consumer will make a request in either a form or like by contacting like a DPO directly, requesting their data from that platform, and then they will get that data back, usually in the form of like a zip file, and then they'll then upload that to the destination service manually themselves. Unfortunately, even though it's kind of easy because it kind of serves the needs of this other subject right as well, the data access subject right, there are many usability problems with this model. For one, a consumer has to be involved at pretty much every step in this process besides, I guess, like the data collection that the origin service is preparing for the consumer. They need to make the request, which is often not standardized between platforms, and they have to monitor their email for sometimes weeks on end until they get a notification that their data is ready to be downloaded. And even then, they still have to upload it to the destination service. Depending on the type of data you're requesting and the strength of your internet access, something like as easy as like downloading your data might not be as trivial as it sounds either. If you're making a request to like a cloud photo storage service, for example, that you've been using for over a decade, this data packet might contain like dozens of gigabytes of data, which would be pretty hard to download in one go with kind of most internet providers. Finally, the last barrier I'll talk about in the consumer perspective is the challenge that comes with uploading your data to the destination service, which I kind of touched on before. This challenge is, of course, not just on the consumer side, but also on the destination services side, right? Because they'll have to, and Lisa will talk about this a little later, but they'll have to find a way to make sense of the data, the format of the data, and finally adapt that to their own internal data models and data stores. So in this kind of import-export model I've been talking about, there are kind of there's a key tension that arises, which is that the request and response process for data access requests just doesn't meet the requirements of a seamless data transfer scenario like we're talking about. In contrast to this super complex multi-step mechanism, an ideal portability model gives the consumer only one task, which is to authorize the data transfer at the very beginning. From then, the origin service and the destination service will coordinate the data transfer, and the only thing the consumer has to be involved in at that point is to be like, oh, okay, cool, my data was transferred successfully. Of course, easier said than done. There are issues that the consumer faces here as well, such as the lack of standardization in the request process, and like, how does this differ from the access scenario that I was talking about before? Not to mention, this is pretty not well supported by a lot of platforms today. So in one of the last studies I completed in my PhD, we did a survey of around like 500 platforms. And as I show here, only less than 3% of them actually fulfilled this data transfer scenario that I kind of just talked about in this diagram. There is a lot of potential here, especially in designing a UI for the consumer. So in work I did with the Data Transfer Initiative last summer, we built this platform for data donation specifically for research. And while that might not be super immediately applicable to platforms building their own systems, it kind of provides a standard or direction that we can move forward in terms of standardizing what the data transfer request process looks like. And kind of the key thing here is like kind of standardization and good practices at every level so that it's easy for the user to get access to enacting this right. And I'll move on to Lisa's for the rest of the talk.
Yes, the Data Transfer Initiative has been working on this data portability problem, dismantling or making recommendations for how to dismantle all of these barriers. And we benefited greatly from partnering with Arthur on that prototype you just saw. We're also making policy recommendations, and we're making internet standards recommendations, and we're building trust tools. So I'll move on to the interoperability challenges. Non-standardized data packets make it hard for every service to connect to every other service to accept data exports, data transfers. And even when it's a large service and the startup is incentivized to support their data formats, sometimes these data formats aren't well thought out for being complete or for being amenable to synchronization. One of our hypotheses is that data access, server-to-server data access or server-to-agent data access should be consistent with data portability using the same, and data donation, so all of those three use cases, rather than be separate products within a large company, should be unified, and the same solution can serve all of those needs a lot better by not trying to guess exactly how to knock down one thing here, one thing there, one thing there. There's actually a bunch of middle ground and similarity between data donation, data access, AI data access, and data portability. We also have an a priori coordination problem where small services need to apply to every single other platform to get API keys and then maintain those API keys and rotate them and support different OAuth scopes and different OAuth endpoints for each service they connect to. Thank you. And that is a huge problem at scale. I wish somebody would tell me how many API keys a very large online platform might have in its set of secrets, right? Well, I would love to have a back-of-the-envelope estimate for that. Having been in more startups lately than large companies, even a small startup can have 100 API keys pretty quickly and then manage them all and rotate them with what tools. And do application and reapplication processes. So our recommendations for data access, data portability, and data donation is to start by doing just best practice web APIs, just HTTP, OAuth, and JSON data packets. To go a level beyond that, to publish one's schemas and support the same schema over time. Even if it's a unilateral schema defined by one company, still publishing it and making sure that your schema supports syncing, as well as just fetching the data one time, and then every time you fetch it again, you have to worry about overwriting independent changes. And I'm personally a big fan of JSON schema for publishing one's data schema. If you're using JSON, it's extremely natural. And JSON schema is getting standardized in the IETF. And our third level is if we could have some more shared schemas, at least sometimes, even if there's individual variation, having a core universal schema for some data would be hugely helpful. And standardized OAuth scopes. But like that, this is the dream. This would really make it a lot better. And the trust and safety problems would still remain. Trust and safety is tied to that API key issue that I talked about a minute ago, which is that getting an API key from each of the very large platforms, for example, that hosts photos, involves a different application process to each of them to identify the third party and to do trust assurances, because the very large platforms don't want their users to be phished, to be subject to an impersonation attack, to believe that they're doing a nice thing and donating their Strava data to a health charity or their photos to a nature conservancy, but actually it's two guys in a van doing identity theft. And who do you sue if that happens? So the very large online platforms have these expensive partner review programs, often inside their trust and safety departments, that are expensive for everybody. They're expensive for the startups who are trying to break into helping you map your runs or manage your diabetes data or do photo videos for Christmas for your family. And the limitations of these ad hoc systems limit user choice in the end, because fewer third parties are authorized than is ideal for user choice and competition. The requirements are different amongst all the different systems. I won't go into the details, but it's super annoying to try to have to meet different requirements year upon year with all the different major services, and potentially have your startup go out of business if the requirements change or you fail to be able to meet them. It's a bad thing that there's inconsistent outcomes, that a startup might be approved by one large platform but not by another. What does that large platform know that it has rejected this third party? Is it important information? There's no sharing of that information, of who's been rejected, who didn't even apply. We can't even tell the difference from the outside, and so have no way to apply this more generally to protect users. So it just doesn't scale. Y'all are familiar with end-to-end scaling problems. Our recommendations in the Data Trust Registry have been to, first of all, to the extent that we can, agree on a set of criteria that are legitimate, that can be verified, that when a company meets the trust criteria for one large platform, it can be more likely to also meet the trust criteria for another large platform. But we're also building a shared trust registry operated in the public interest, not necessarily the only one there will ever be, but it's ours and we like it and Meta uses it. And that can really help with this end-to-end problem. So our takeaways are we need to spread better, more usable systems. We need to start working a little bit on interoperability and make incremental progress towards shared schemas, better schemas, and possibly standardized schemas. And we really need to tackle the trust problem, which is one of the hardest things to dismantle here. Questions?